lot of the whimsy of this, like having the definitions on the back, with all the dictionary apparatus, came from conversations with him. And in fact, I think having the phonetics and the syllables was his idea. I originally had parts of speech and was very troubled when I was dealing with a word that had both, could be both a noun and a verb. And at one point, they were all sort of broken up. So there'd be one section that was a noun and another section that was a verb. And then in one case, there's also an adjective. And that was just terrible. But I think just putting it at the top, the various parts of speech that it could be, was enough. And that's where it ended up.
Well, I mean, visually, it's very satisfying because it's, like one of those nesting Russian dolls. Inside is something else and something else, until it really does feel like you're reading a book of poetry. You're reading definitions. You're reading somebody's psyche, because one of the things I love about these is sometimes they go from the very mundane. I think in the poem Elephant, I think there's some description of gray as like a gray rock.
A heavy gray stone in the hand, yeah.
That's right. A very mundane thing. But then the last line is that they hold wakes for their dead, which has sort of left me breathless. So, you think you're going to read definitions, but really in just a few short lines, you're going through a whole journey of a person's psyche, from the mundane to the sublime. So, and
the sequencing there is important too. The ordering of, I'm not saying this was usually very rational. It was sort of by feel, but that felt like a very important thing to get right. And there were a few of them that started out just being conventional poems, but it felt okay to break them up that way. Snail did, and Persistence did.
Yeah, one of the things that was very useful for me, as you and I've had these kind of conversations over the course of you developing the book, was I've been working on another book of poetry myself, the first one I've written in 7 years. And I know you've probably read some of the poems because a couple of them have been published online. And I went back and looked at the manuscript that I had so far, and I thought, my gosh, Judy's actually onto something here, because even though I think of each poem as a separate construction, I could see how the writer in the back of my mind, who's really in charge of whatever it is I'm doing, was thinking of these things in a related way. It starts with a short poem. Many of my poetry books start with a short poem that's a little bit pissed off. And then at the end, I think my arc is from the being a little angry, a little post-hippie Schadenfreude, and going back to at the end, I think it ends up with a little hope and spirit. But I hadn't thought of it that way until you and I began discussing structure, and I was claiming to be so random, and I realized absolutely not. These poems also, created.
I bet when we were working on This Strange Life that I might have poked you a little bit about the order in which things were.
You did.
Because I always do.
Yeah, but I'm also very, I'm very easy about that.
Yeah, you're great to work with. I mean,
no,
really.
Thank you. Well, because I assume that you and the person who does a lot of my editing, his name is Paul Burke, I just assume you guys know a lot more than I do. And whatever you say, okay, fine, you'll make it better. So, but we're talking about these poems. You should read some of the definitions. So read a couple that.
By the way, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the elephant poem. Have you seen the video that Nancy Rodman did?
It's beautiful, and I can't watch it because something bad happens to the elephant.
Yeah, it's really dark.
And
it's darker than the poem is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to change the commercials on TV when, the pet commercials come on, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just opened this by accident, and here's Metaphor, which is technically the first one of its kind that I ever did. And it says metaphor, metaphor, also for, noun from the Greek metaphora, which we have in Greek letters. 1, carriage, freightage, traction, traffic, a sign on the side of a moving van in Athens, beds, bureaus, boxes of books. 2, the young tomcat tracks birds in the branches, his haunches prepare for launch. 3, I fold and float paper boats. I am very fond of that last piece.
It's lovely. It's
That's
really
what
lovely.
we do. We fold and float paper boats.
That's right.
And
Right.
there's that idea that I have often had when you send out a manuscript that you're putting a message in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean.
Yeah.
And there's also a thing that Dulce Maria Loinas, the Cuban poet, who's the first translation book that I did, she has a poem about Noah on the ark in which she says, I send a word into the air, it does not come back. And that's kind of echoing in this poem.
I'll read some more.
Well, since I mentioned Dulce Maria, I will read Bat, which actually quotes from her, because the idea in here, well, I never read this idea anywhere else. Bat, which is both a verb and a noun. 1, heavy oak or ash, narrow waist, clubbed head. Not since high school have I felt that heft in my hand, the pull of it in my shoulders as I swing. 2, one night the student renting my upstairs room ran down shouting about a big black bird. The Bat Man installed one-way valves so bats could fly out but not come back. 3, y en tu menudo cuerpo caben dos glorias que jamás unen en otro ser, alas y pecho. And in your small body, 2 glories fit that never unite in another being, wings and breasts. 4, bats in cages in a Chinese market may have been the source of COVID-19. 5, the cat's paw targets anything that moves. 6, she hunts in the high dark, nurses her young as she hangs on the wall.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, the last one is kind of stolen from Loinas, but what an idea. I mean,
Yeah.
who would have thunk about it except a poet like Loinas?
Yeah.
Wings
Well,
and breasts.
it's also, you put bats in the spotlight in a better way than just, maybe they gave us COVID-19.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I'm very much a kind of amateur naturalist, much more since I moved here. But I got involved with the iNaturalist group, which is an online kind of research hobby thing. And all the photographs that I have taken all my life of plants and animals, and this goes back a long way, I can post on there. And if somebody agrees with my identification of the thing, then it becomes research grade. I asked in the forum, can I post old stuff? And people said, oh yeah, I mean, you know, there are some people who are interested in knowing what has changed over time. So as long as you know where and when you saw it, it's legitimate. And I said, well, what about the Galapagos? I mean, everybody takes pictures of blue-footed boobies, right?
Yeah.
And they said, do it, do it. So I've got like, I don't know, 120 observations, of which most of them are research grade. A few of them nobody else has approved in, unless somebody else comes along and says it's correct, it's considered casual.
I'd like you to read the poem Definition, because it has one of my favorite lines in there, which we can talk about. You say that it's almost as if a definition, I wrote it here, it's my wish for certainty amid ambiguity.
Yeah, that's
and
one of the lines.
I thought that was like a core line in the whole book, because the other subject I would like you to, well, you read that and then we'll talk a little bit.
Okay, definition, which is a noun. 1, clarity of outline, the light at dawn illumining each edge of building or tree. 2, clarity of meaning. 3, resolution of vision, the details through binoculars or microscope or after squeezing in eye drops. 4, dictionary entry, including etymology, pronunciation, usages. 5, my wish for certainty amid ambiguity. Yeah, it's funny you point that out, because I think, that first section about clarity of outline, I think I've tried to write that poem 2 or 3 times over the last 30 years. The way that you can't see anything, and then suddenly you can sort of see things, and as the light grows. And I'm hardly ever up that time of day, I have to tell you.
It's, for me, that poem even harkens back to some of your earlier work, like Aleph Broken, because the other, I talk to you a lot about how I think structure is an important feature of your work, but I think also in terms of what one actually feels when they're reading your poetry, and I think you must feel it somewhere in there when you're writing it, is the whole tension between the secular and the sublime. The known and the divine, what we don't know.
Yeah.
And so you could talk about that a little bit, because I saw it in Aleph, but I see it even more in definition. And even again, just to go back to the elephant poem, from the rock to the wake, from the most base form of life, and then to creatures standing at the edge of, death, looking into it and wondering, what is it? So I'm sure you must have some idea in your mind that your work just radiates this sense of life and death.
I have always felt that if you know what you're writing before you write it, it's not going to be any good. You ask it what it means. And if you're lucky, a few years later, you might understand what it is that you made. And I write, well, it's very strange, because I really believe in the sort of the split brain theory of creativity. But if you get out of your own way, primary process stuff, imagery, a very physical, kinetic kind of sense of things, even though they're made out of words, but you're creating an experience for the reader. It's not an idea, it's an experience. It could have ideas in it, maybe. And the other side of my brain, the critic, which is pretty energetic, actually. But I used to tell my students, get that out of the room when you're composing, because it's going to tell you have nothing to say. That's stupid. I've heard it before. All that stuff. You need to put it away, hang it up, stick it in the closet, tell it, take a coffee break. I'll call you when I need you. Never darken my door again, because you do need it, but you need it after you've got stuff on the paper. And then it can tell you what's interesting, what's fresh, what's got some buzz to it, and what it's heard before. And then it isn't like throw it out. It's like wherever it's something that isn't working is a door. And I got that idea from Kim Adonizio's book. It's a door. If it doesn't work, open the door, because there's something behind it that you haven't gotten to yet. But that's all the strangest mixture, when you're as experienced as you and I are, the strangest mixture of conscious, critical craftsmanship kind of work, and just getting out of the way of it and letting yourself get surprised.
I in reading some of James Tate's later work, James Tate went from, he was always a little odd and eccentric, but he wrote poems that you recognized as poems, stanzas, and they took up a certain space on the page. And later in life, towards the end of his life, he just began, it seems, writing whatever was in his head, almost as if he sat down at the typewriter, and he used a typewriter, sat down at the typewriter and just described what was going on around him, but in his own odd, eccentric way. And that's, you just made me think of that.
Well, you know, that's funny because I used to say, as Archie says in Archie and Mehetabel, I have the soul of the Vers Libre poet. You know, I thought of myself as a free verse poet. And I, like, the only sonnet I ever wrote until very recently was a terrible satirical take on the idea of a sonnet, which I wrote in 11th grade, and I got the only C I ever got from that teacher. Because, you know, behold, the teacher said, here is a sonnet with meter both iambic and pentam.
Yeah.
So 14 gilded lines are written upon. I mean, it was really, oh, but of course it was intended to be. And what I'm fascinated by the fact that some of the things that I really consider to be, almost want to say breakthrough things, although the real breakthrough was Mothering, which was prose poetry. It was 50 pages or 52 pages, prose poem. I used to say if I were French, it would be my novel, but I'm an American, so it's prose poetry. But it had characters and there's a vague sense of time passing. But I felt like I could say anything. And, you know, when we were talking a minute ago, I was thinking that's what I find so exciting about this form. I feel like I can say anything. Even though it feels, I think it is a very disciplined form. At the same time, what makes it work is, you know, this one's funny and that one's poignant and this one's just kind of intellectual and that one's, and I use little bits of song lyrics. I want to sing the one that's got a song lyric in it.
Okay.
This is Trade, which is a noun and a verb. 1, exchange, commerce, swap meet. 2, in publishing a real book, not a chapbook or non-standard binding. 3, a sign in a shop window meaning wholesale only. 4, has been done with wives, husbands, children. 5, in Amsterdam there lived a maid, mark well what I do say. In Amsterdam there lived a maid, and she was mistress of her trade. I'll no more go roving with thee, fair maid. And you know, that thing about the sign in the shop window, that's New York. That's all those neighborhoods where the sign in the window says to the trade.
Yeah. Well,
you know, I didn't live in New York since I was 20, but that's kind of stuck.
It stays. Well, now so you've given me the perfect opening to ask you something else specific, which is the importance of voice to your poetry and song. And I want to read you something because I was reading some of your stuff this afternoon and it reminded me of something important to me. So let's see. In one of the poems in here, Voice, you write, year after year, honey in my throat, but I'm jealous of it, wanting to be heard, not wanting to be heard. And it made me think, you know, I'm a tremendous Leonard Cohen, I don't even know if fan is the right word. His work has meant a great deal to me in my life. But it reminded me of one of his songs in Tower of Song, where he says, I was born like this, I had no choice. I was born with the gift of a golden voice. And of course, when he sang this song, he was an old man. He had no voice left. But when he sang this song in concert, everyone would stand up and cheer because what they wanted him to know was how loved he was. And he did have a golden voice. And it wasn't the voice coming out of his throat at the moment. It was his poetry, his songs. So, I mean, there you have a very obvious example of a person who back and forth in his life, poetry and song were always woven together. But it seems to me your work also contains some connection to your your interest in song and voice, your performances, you have a fantastically beautiful voice, an expressive voice. So I think your poetry contains in it some shadow, some reflection, I guess a better way to say it, of your interest in voice and your performances.
I've never been able to quite figure it out. I did my dissertation on W.S. Merwin.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason was because after I first heard him read, I felt like his voice invaded my poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I was writing in his voice. And I wanted in the dissertation to understand where that came from. And by the way, I totally failed. I got all interested in doing a kind of Campbellian or Jungian hero journey thing, which I did. And fame and what's the word? Ambisexuality, that's not the word I want. Androgyny,
Mm-hmm.
and relationships with the wild. And that all was fine, but I never answered to myself why his voice came into my voice. I know how I got rid of it. I noticed it and I stopped doing that. I didn't need it anymore, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never, it's funny, my students used to all think that I didn't like rhymed poetry. And I always said, no, that is not true. And then I would read them, Mona Van Dyne's wonderful poem called The Vision Test, which
Mm-hmm.
is the cleverest, sneakiest, most wonderful rhymed poem that I know. And it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, all the way through. It's just fabulous. But with very few exceptions, I don't rhyme, but I have a lot of sound work. And I don't use regular meter, but I have a lot of rhythm, which is something I realized I was doing even in the prose poem.
Mm-hmm.
It's very elastic. But for instance, in the poem that I read, Metaphora, it's in the other side. The young tomcat tracks birds in the branches, his haunches prepare for launch.
Mm-hmm.
I did not plan that.
Mm-hmm.
It happened because that musical sense, I think it's because the sense of music in my ear just makes me do a lot of assonance, a lot of consonants, that kind of slant rhyme, which isn't all that slant in this case. Haunch and launch are really true rhyme, except that it's haunches and launch, so it is a slant.
Mm-hmm.
But even Emily Dickinson slanted most of the time.
But I mean, even more, the sense of musicality that I think goes back and forth between your poetry and, I would imagine, your singing work, your voice work, because I don't think these two things exist separately.
No. And in that, I have this occasional impulse to try to pull all of these different parts of myself together. And one of the ways that has happened has been to try to set some of the poems to music. I've only once found a composer who wanted to do that for me. And I actually like my version of that poem, my setting for that poem, better than hers, although hers is very nice. So what can you do? I've only done like 4 or 5 of them because I don't really have the discipline to do much of that. And it takes a lot of discipline. But I do feel them to be related. I don't know quite how they are, but I play guitar a little bit. I studied piano when I was a kid, and I played cello in high school. But boy, did I get rid of that as fast as I could. But as soon as I started singing, that's the thing in that quotation that you gave. That on the one hand, I want to sing for everybody, and on the other hand, I feel like I'm not supposed to show off.
Mm.
So I don't put myself forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was interested, to go back to sort of the beginning of what you were saying about Merwin. I think that I know that I think we all do it. One of the ways when we're younger that we teach ourselves to write is by writing in other people's styles and other people's voices. I mean,
but I'm not usually conscious of it.
Well, I don't think we do it now. I think that, we've...
Yeah, but I mean, even then, I didn't set out to do that.
No, you just heard it
just
in your.
invaded it. It just invaded me.
That's right. That's why I have a closet. I'm going to tell you a Donald Barthelme story in a minute, but I have a closet to my left, which is full of my old manuscripts, even stuff I wrote as a child. And I can tell you, my fake Edgar Allan Poe stuff is probably quite impressive. I want to go back to the voice in a minute, but I'm going to segue for a
I have
second.
my old stuff too.
Yes. So Donald Barthelme, when I was younger, I had my 15 minutes of fame, and I kind of met a lot of writers and poets, and Donald Barthelme was a friend of a friend, and I went to his apartment in the Village once for dinner, and Donald was a famous, not telling any tales, Donald drank a lot. He was famous for it. And we were all sitting around dinner. I was maybe 19 years old. I'm terrified of him and everybody else. And they started talking about his archives because he was very famous and how he had to be careful to preserve all his papers, and they were going to go to some university. And I just remember him standing up from the table, going over to the closet where he kept all his stuff, opening the door dramatically, and with matches, he pulled matches out of his pocket and said, "Why don't we just burn it all?" You know? And his wife, Marion, had to like pull him away. And I remember thinking, this is New York. Here I am. I'm in it now. These are the famous crazy writers in the Village. I was terrified of these people. But anyway, he didn't burn his archives, and it did end up at some university in Texas. But anyway, I think, the influence of all these people that we read when we're younger, it's like, it's a shell. We put on the shell for walk around in it and write like them. But I think you really are coming into your own when you begin to break away from all of that.
Well, the funny thing is, the work that felt like I was coming into my own was mothering.
Mm-hmm.
And mothering was possible because I read Creeley's daybooks, and I read Monica Wittig's Les Guerrières,
mm-hmm.
which is a French novel.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden I understood something about what prose was capable of.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a poem. It's a poem. And the thing that made it a poem in that case was all of these sort of mental slides into dream space
mm-hmm.
that would happen over and over again in each piece. And some of those pages went through like 50 revisions. And the work of the revision was for the critic side of my head to say, yeah, that's kind of flat. I've heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
Go further, open the door. And that was another draft. And there was one that's, I don't even remember what the words are, but there's like a one-liner in that book.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one page with a line on it. And mostly they're pretty close to a full page of prose.
Mm.
But they're musical prose. And I don't know what we mean by musical prose, except these patterns of sound, which I'm very much aware that I use. And I'm also very much aware that I don't draft doing that consciously, but then when I'm revising, I notice it. And in the case of something like the tomcat, preparing his haunches for launch, that was not on purpose. But I recognize it and I say, oh, look what I did.
I guess for me, the really important lesson I learned, and I've written about this many times, is the importance of the last line of a poem. And I got that message long ago. Maybe I was 17 the first time I read Leonard Cohen's poem Travel. And the poem goes along a certain way, and then the last two lines just go off somewhere completely else. But they're so beautiful, and they're connected in a way to the story he was telling in the poem before, the stanzas before. And that for me was the light bulb that went on in my head, because reading his work, it was the first time I had, in school, all they ever read us was like Robert Browning or Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Emily Dickinson. I slept through.
Thereby hang many a person who doesn't think they like poetry.
Oh yes, they're like my last Duchess on what the hell does that mean? You know, and they kept asking these poor little 11 and 12-year-olds, what does it mean? I have no idea. I wasn't sure what a duchess even was. But, you know, the first time I read Leonard Cohen's poetry, that's when I thought, I can do that. I get it. I understand that. And then I still will go back, you know, it's 50 years, but I'll go back to the first book of his I ever bought, The Spice Box of Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll read it as a sort of manual again, because I can always go back to his work and how did he do that? And I can hear,
Yeah,
you know, I
yeah.
can almost hear him thinking, I'll change this word and that sort of thing. So who's been your Leonard Cohen?
Well, I grew up with my parents' library,
Mm-hmm.
and there was an anthology of 20th century poetry. I think it may have been Louis Untermeyer. I'm not sure, but you know, the Hollow Men was in there,
Mm-hmm.
and Rachel Lindsay was in there, and Frost, of course, and Sandberg. I loved Sandberg early on. And when I was in college, I think it was probably Levertov. When you were talking about the last line, I remember I did independent study with a professor at Rochester named Dick Gollin, who was not a poet, but he was a really good teacher of poets on a one-on-one kind of basis. And I did at least a semester with him. And we were talking about Levertov's poem about the all-day bird. The all-day bird does this, and the all-day bird does that. And at the end, it goes, sun, light, light, light. And he said to me, it's funny that the things you remember, he said to me, there's nothing in the poem that leads you to expect that ending.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to me, and it's interesting to me because one of the things that I constantly found myself saying to students, and not only students, you know, fellow peer poets in workshops, the last line is often what you need to lose.
Mm-hmm. People
always feel like they have to wrap it up in a bow, or they have to explain it, or it has to be kind of a Beethoven ending. No. And I like a line that suspends itself.
Mm-hmm.
That when the poem ends, there's kind of an echo.
It's interesting because I think I do something a little bit different. I think I do go sort of for the soft boom at the end, because I find myself, not only have I been working on a book of poetry, I've also been writing, and you've read some of them, I think, short stories. And I find that the short fiction is working for me the same way poems do, which is I understand the last line first. Before I understand what the story is, I know what the last line is.
No, I can understand. I mean, I have no gift for fiction at all. I've written like 3 stories, and the longest one is 11 pages. But you're right, that story started as a poem that didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And the last image of the book, of the story, is what was in that poem. It was all headed for that image.
Yeah, and I think that can help, because it's almost like it's like one of your palindromes, and I only mean that in the sense that it's an unexpected structure or challenge that you've given yourself.
Sure.
Well, if that's the last line, what's the story?
Yeah.
And you know, usually the story fits on top of the last line. Sometimes I struggle with it, and I really have to figure out, you know, does the rest of the story actually does it come naturally to this last line? And if it doesn't, the last line's going to stay. The rest of the story then isn't working. So
That's interesting.
yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, I think,
you know, I was starting to say before that I started out as a free verse poet.
mm-hmm.
But the forms that really mattered to me first was the prose poem,
Mm-hmm.
because I could say anything. But then I discovered, you know, the Sestina, although I've only written one, but you know, I'd read one by Anthony Hecht that I thought was a terrible poem.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going like, what's wrong with this poem? And as soon as I understood what was wrong with this poem, I started writing my own. It is not regularly cycled. So it's an irregular or even a false sestina. But I've used that as an exercise with students, because that kind of form, and another one that absolutely love is the alphabetic acrostic, the abecedarian,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know what you're going to say. And the only job you have is to get to the next letter of the alphabet. And you go places that you had no idea what the poem was going to do, just because that structure. And I think in a way, the alphabet poems are like that. The definition poems are like that too. Maybe not quite the same way. They're not as tight.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that, I mean, if you go forward in your life as a writer, you know, we often talk about poets and writers talk amongst themselves, and people write articles about it, how poets seem to peter out. You
I'm
don't
not
find,
petering out. I'm
no, no, no.
75.
I was going to say, I think that those of us who go forward are the ones who not only, well, let me go back a second. I think one of the reasons poets sometimes stop midlife is that I remember I had a big conversation with Richard Stern about this long ago when I was young, and he was a lot older than me, but he was one of the few people I wasn't scared of when I was younger. But it was the sense of when you're young, poetry, like music, gives you the ability to just pour your feelings into it. You know, poetry can just be this explosion of feelings with words kind of stuck all around it. But if you read the poem, you know, oh boy, this person is angry or upset or in love or crazy. So I think something happens somewhere, you know, a little bit later in life where you're not working from that same fiery energy that you had when you were 19. So I think that's something that happens to poets, some poets. But I think if you push past that barrier, one of the things that carries us onward in our lives as writers and particularly as poets is the understanding of craft.
Sure.
You become enamored of the craft of writing the way I think, at least I'll speak for myself, when I was younger, I had no idea. I thought this was just, there were no computers when I started. This was just yellow paper, a pen, me up late at night going blah, 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 blah. And it never occurred to me to edit anything because I wrote it. It must be fantastic.
Oh, I've met that poet.
Yes, I wrote it. It's perfect. So, but you know, I'm 69. I'm going to be 70 next January. I am grateful that I continue to be able to say to myself, you fixed that, or you figured out how to do that. And just crafting, you know, I'm not obsessive, but if some sentence or something needs to be fixed, to understand how to do it and why to do it. So I had a friend when I was younger who was a photographer, and she was very good. And she was the one who first said to me, I can't just be looking through the camera. I have to understand how this camera works. I may be out in the field somewhere and I'm not, you know, something's going to get stuck and I'm going to need to change something. I need to understand how the camera works. And that has stuck with me because it's like, okay, now I really need to understand how writing works.
But you know, there's another piece of it, because when people talk about craft, I'm aware that one of the things that I value the most in my skill set is the ability to go into that dream state. You know, to have a word kind of hang on my head and go, oh, that's interesting, and just sort of start playing in it. Playing in it, I said, and I think that's what I mean. And, you know, particularly in this book, which is full of wordplay and pun. I mean, the whole concept of the book is pun, which of course is a very Jewish thing, because that goes back to, you know, the people who wrote the Bible. And certainly all the interpreters of the Bible. That if you've got two words that sound the same, like Adam, which is Adam, and Adama, which is the earth, and Adam was made of Adama, and that they do stuff with this.
And of course, that's the foundation of vaudeville and burlesque. It's all of
Yeah,
that.
sure.
So, But
Well, you know, we're like 5 minutes of 7, and I'm wondering if Jackie wants to, if there are any questions or, you know, how we should wrap up.
Yeah, sure. The conversation has been so amazing. Thank you both so much. Any questions from the audience, you could type them into the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Crickets.
well, perhaps it was so fascinating that we explained everything.
I don't know. Wow. This was
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just, someone was giving a thumbs up, so I wasn't sure if they
okay.
were
As I
ready.
saw.
Well, this was tremendous fun.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh,
this is a little bit of a mutual admiration society, and
Yeah.
that's
Well,
okay. And I have to thank you for the support you've given me. You know, on this book and on the one before, I didn't know what I was doing with Olive. I mean, I really was struggling with that book for a long time.
but it turned out to be a beautiful composition, and you know, a really sturdy framework with some beautiful spiritual, extraordinary poetry inside
You
it.
know, that question you raised about spiritual, yeah, I don't know how that shows up in the book, but the way in which I've kind of been what they used to call in the old days a natural scientist, which is not exactly an ecologist, but it's more like ecology than, you know, zoology, certainly. The sense of the wonderfulness of the world and
Mhm.
of the human mind and of art, which, and you know, music. I mean, think about an art form that the moment it is created, it evaporates.
Mhm.
Dance is like that too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are notation systems for it,
Right.
but it's ephemera and it's
Yeah.
it's structuring time. And that's the only thing you can say about it, is that it is structuring time.
Mhm.
That's amazing to me. I mean, how could that be? What in the human brain created the surplus of energy that made that possible?
Well, our minds are a mystery.
Yeah, yeah.
and last, so now I have to challenge you both. What is your last word that you're going to leave us with? Or a couple words to end this beautiful discussion.
Well, my last words would be everybody should absolutely read Definitions. It's a beautiful book.
I agree. I agree.
Thank you. And my last word would be ambiguity.
Mm,
Mhm.
I love that. Thank you everyone for coming out. Please support both Eleanor and Judith by purchasing their work.
And which you can get at the Golden Notebook.
You can get it at the Golden Notebook at Woodstock. And if you're someplace else, ask your independent bookstore to get their books in stock, because you can do that. Everyone have a beautiful evening. Enjoy a wonderful June night.
Thank you all. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, Judy.
Good night.
Good night.
Talk to you soon.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.